This video is all about the development gap and more specifically the strategies that we can use to reduce it. By the development gap, all we mean is the differences in wealth and quality of life between the most developed and least developed countries across the world. So by wealth, we obviously mean how much money they have, and by quality of life, we're talking about how happy and healthy people are that live in that country, how good their lives are. Now, in terms of the strategies that we can use to reduce the development gap, this might be quite a confusing phrase, but all it means is the methods that are being used to help NEE countries and LICs to increase their development. Those strategies might focus on social development, for example, improving people's quality of life, or they might focus on economic development, focusing on increasing people's wealth. Obviously, the best strategies are going to focus on both of those aspects together. We can divide our development strategies into two different groups. There are top-down strategies and there are bottom-up strategies. And using these two categories is really useful because it helps you to think about the advantages and the disadvantages of the different strategies that you have studied. So top-down strategies are large-scale approaches that are administered or carried out by governments or large corporations, so big companies. And this strategy is based on the idea that the wealth created by big organisations like a government or like a big company will eventually trickle down and benefit everybody within that country. Whereas bottom-up strategies are small scale and they lift people out of poverty by helping them directly. And this strategy is based on the idea of helping people to help themselves. So going directly to individuals or local communities rather than waiting for the impact of a big company or a government action. And bottom-up strategies are seen as more sustainable because the economic development doesn't rely on those big companies or corporations that could eventually leave the country at any time. We're now going to look at some different top-down strategies, starting with investment. Now, investment is when large companies open up part of their business in a country, for example, a factory or an office. And by large companies, we are talking about TNCs or transnational corporations. These are big companies that operate in more than 2 countries around the world. An example of this that you have studied is when Fiat opened their car production plant in Brazil in the 1970s, which created 12,000 jobs. Now, an advantage of investment is it often improves the infrastructure in the surrounding area, so things like transport routes or utilities like gas and electric. It wouldn't be very useful for a company like Fiat to open their car production plant but then not be able to transport or export their finished product due to the roads around their plant being so poor. So investment of this kind often improves the whole area around the business that is opening up. However, a disadvantage of investment is the profit made by the company will typically benefit the country that the company is registered in overall. So the profit made by a company like Fiat won't remain in Brazil, it will actually flow out of Brazil and back to the company where Fiat is based. A second strategy that we're going to look at is industrial development. And industrial development just means focusing on developing industry, so secondary employment like factories or construction. And this can be funded by the government or it can be funded by private companies. So actually the example of Fiat's car production plant could also be used as an example of industrial development because they are making cars at that production plant. An advantage of industrial development is it provides jobs that can be done by unskilled workers, which will lead to an increase in employment within a country. So it means that more people will have jobs. And this is particularly useful in countries where education hasn't been rolled out across the whole country. So it means that you can increase employment without having to increase education at exactly the same rate. However, a disadvantage of industry is that it tends to create lots of environmental issues such as more air pollution or more waste, and we know that those issues can then actually have negative impacts on people's quality of life. A third strategy is debt relief. Now, debt is obviously the term we use when you owe money to someone or something. And there are lots of LIC countries that are in huge amounts of debt to either other more developed countries or global organisations like the World Bank. Debt relief is when that debt is restructured so that it's easier for the country to pay it off, or when the total debt that that country owes is reduced. So actually they owe less money overall. An example of this is the Jubilee Debt Campaign, and they've been working since 1996 to reduce or cancel the debt of lots of LIC countries around the world. A good thing about debt relief is it means that if a country has less debt to pay off, there will be more money available for them to develop their country. So, for example, to invest in healthcare or in education. However, a problem with this strategy is that there is no guarantee that money a country has saved will be used to support development. Lastly, we are going to look at tourism. Now, tourism obviously involves people holidaying in a country, and this can generate income in a variety of different ways. So obviously, when tourists spend money in local businesses, that means that that local business is more successful, it's making more money, and therefore it will have to pay more business tax. It also might mean that the number of staff that they employ is increased. An example of a country where tourism has really made an impact is Jamaica. Obviously, Jamaica has a warm climate and it has beautiful beaches, and that's one of the reasons why so many people want to visit it on holiday. Together, that has led to tourism contributing 11% to the country's total GDP. So in other words, tourism alone is making 11% of Jamaica's total wealth. An advantage of tourism is that it creates this positive multiplier effect. So as I've already alluded to, the more tourists who visit, the more money that will be spent in the local economy. That means the more jobs there will be and the more tax that will be paid. And obviously that tax that can then be used to develop things like education, infrastructure and healthcare, things that will develop the country. However, tourism is particularly vulnerable to global events. So if a global recession happened and countries and individuals lost money, they wouldn't have the money to then go abroad and go on holiday. Similarly to what's happening now with COVID, global pandemics result in most international travel being cancelled, and therefore both of those things would mean a country that relies on tourism would not be able to make any money. We're now going to focus on our bottom-up strategies, and we've got 3 examples to think about. The first example is microfinance loans. Now these involve giving individuals, usually women, small loans to help them start their own business in their local community. An example of this is that the International Finance Corporation has actually invested $121 million to support the Brazilian government in providing microfinance loans to favela residents, so people that live in Brazil's favelas. An advantage of microfinance loans is that because the loans are small, they are easy to pay back, and that makes them a sustainable way to help people to start their own business. However, a disadvantage is that this strategy tends to be very small scale, and so you would need lots of these strategies happening across a country, perhaps to see an overall impact. Second strategy that we're going to look at is appropriate technology, sometimes called intermediate technology. This refers to giving local communities access to cheap, easy to use technology which can then help them with their work or to improve their living standards, or maybe even both at the same time. An example that you've studied of appropriate technology is Makueni in Kenya, where they use corrugated metal sheets to create a rainwater harvesting system, and this led to an increase in their crop yields of sweet potato and maize. An advantage of appropriate technology is that it supports communities in increasing their income with long-term impacts. So it's a sustainable way of helping a community to increase their income that will last for a long time. However, it obviously relies on the technology being donated or bought in the first place, which might not be achievable for all local communities. The final strategy to focus on is fair trade. Fair trade is an organisation that works to ensure that farmers receive a fair price for their crops. And an example of this is the plantation Martha Maria in Colombia, which is a banana plantation with 45 workers. The Fair Trade Premium has been invested in projects such as setting up a low-interest loan scheme to help workers buy their own house. So another thing to mention about fair trade is not only do they make sure that farmers receive a fair price, but they also have this scheme called the Fair Trade Premium, which allows local communities and farmers to invest in projects which will help their local community to develop. For example, this loan scheme. An advantage of fair trade is it obviously ensures farmers receive a stable and fair price for their crops, and that might mean that their business can therefore expand and they can employ more people. However, some people criticise fair trade because the process for farmers to become fair trade certified is initially quite expensive. Now, there's one more strategy that we are yet to talk about, and that is aid. And that's because it doesn't fit neatly into those two categories of either top-down or bottom-up development. And the reason for that is that there are so many different types of aid, it really depends on which type we are talking about. Generally speaking, by aid, we mean countries or organisations donating money or resources in order to help a country with its social and economic development. As a reminder, there are 6 different types of aid that you need to be familiar with. Short-term, long-term, tied, voluntary, bilateral, and multilateral. If we take the example of tied aid, this refers to aid that comes with certain conditions, so it has to be used for a specific goal. As an example, the USA gave Brazil $815,000 to improve healthcare, law enforcement, which means policing, and environmental development. So that money could only be used to improve those 3 areas. Now that is an example of top-down development because that money was given to the Brazilian government because it's them who have the responsibility to deliver things like healthcare services and policing. As a contrast, if we look at voluntary aid, this refers to individuals donating money to charities who then distribute the money or resources that they've bought with that money to individuals or local communities. An example of this might be charities like Oxfam, who work to fund projects around the world in order to end extreme poverty. And obviously, Oxfam relies on donations from individuals. Now, that is an example of bottom-up development, as the money or the resources are given directly to local communities, rather than waiting for an organisation like the government or a company to do something which leads to the wealth trickling down. Okay, the money or the resources are given directly to the local community. In terms of the positives and negatives of aid, aid can be really effective in helping countries to respond to crises, so things like natural disasters, for example, or when the aid is given with a particular aim, a clear aim. So tied aid, for example, can be really effective. However, some of the problems with aid is it can create a sense of dependency. So by that we mean LICs start to rely on those countries that have donated money to them in the past to send more and more money. It can also be misused by corrupt governments, meaning that the aid isn't reaching the people who need it the most.